if you're a teacher, right, and you're going on a field trip, there's too many kids to manage. You have to break them into groups. You have to get chaperones, and then it's much easier to kind of manage that group. And so it's great because it's easier. It takes some of the stress off you. Maybe splits it up, makes it more manageable. But it also means you have to have more chaperones or more revenue managers, right, looking at this stuff when you do it. And it also means there's kind of more papers to grade at the end of the day. So you just kind of have to balance how many groups it is. But what it does is it just makes it more manageable chunks.
Say, well, if you have 300 listings, can you really group them into just 7? But thinking in terms of how you drill down, right? So maybe you have 3 distinct locations and you start with that. And then underneath that, you want to think about if you have just then like a big kind of mess of 15 that don't really have a logic or a way to look at a roll up, that might start to get messy. And to Jordan's point, right? You really can't process that.
Welcome to RevLabs by PriceLabs.
Welcome to PriceLabs RevLabs December Masterclass. My name is Becca. I lead our US Solutions team, and today we have some great panelists. We're really going to be focusing on segmenting and grouping listings and how doing this efficiently and effectively will actually help you with revenue growth as well as time savings. So a couple of ground rules. Most of you have discovered our chat, which is awesome. If you could, if you have questions, please put those in the Q&A. We do have Aditya on our team who is here to help with Q&A. If there's any questions that the panelists should answer, he'll pass those to us as well. But if you're putting your questions in the webinar chat, sometimes we can miss it, and we do want to answer all of the questions that y'all have. So chat is great for commentary if you want to tell us something, but questions in Q&A. Now, a little bit about PriceLabs, a little bit about RevLabs. So PriceLabs was founded in 2014 in Chicago. We currently price over 450,000 listings worldwide. So we have 10 years of revenue management experience, and we work with tens of thousands of customers worldwide, revenue managers, property managers alike. We work with everything from short-term rentals to mid-term rentals to small hotels, RVs, campgrounds, you name it. And I do like to point out our industry recognitions because we are so proud of those. Even though we've been around for 10 years, we are still staying relevant. We were the winner of the Shorty's 2023 Ancillary Service Provider Award. We were a nominee in Skift's Ideas Awards last year, and I believe we are one this year as well, which is really exciting. So one of PriceLabs, driving factors is democratizing data and democratizing sort of education of revenue management. So that is what RevLabs is here for. We're trying to bring experts in the industry to your either headphones if you're listening into the podcast or to your computer if you're watching us live. Today we do have 2 incredible speakers that I know pretty well. We've got Heather Richer, who's a partner at Richer Logic, and Jordan Locke, who's founder and principal consultant at RevParty. Would y'all want to maybe introduce yourselves a little bit? Heather, we can start with you.
Sure. Hi, I'm Heather with Richer Logic, and I've been doing revenue management pretty much my whole career across resorts, restaurants, hotels. I was head of revenue distribution for Kimpton Hotels and have been in the short-term rental space going on 7 years. And at Richer Logic, we provide revenue management and distribution services, primarily focused to help short-term rental, vacation rental operators. And we do some hybrid hotels as well. I know that's like an emerging trend. And again, focused just in the revenue management distribution lane. So that's me and Richer Logic.
Hey, I'm Jordan Locke. I've been pricing pretty much my whole career, only vacation rentals and revenue management since about 2018. Since then, I've worked for various startups, consultant clients, and major OTAs, kind of setting up revenue management programs. So what we do is we try to really incorporate kind of other industry pricing practices into the vacation rental space when we can.
Awesome. Super excited to have y'all here. That's not my clicker. Cool. So today we are going to learn how to effectively segment our properties. Whether you have 50 properties or 500 or 1,000, segmentation is something that if you implement it early in your processes, it's going to make your lives so much easier, both in your reporting, in your operations, really just throughout any aspect of your revenue management. So today we're going to sort of talk about 4 main parts of segmentation. So 1, why is it important? 2, how do we do it? So mastering segmentation for large portfolios. How are we going to drive revenue through these different targeted group strategies that we're coming up with? And then 4, how are we saving time through efficient portfolio management via the segmentation? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen just because, we can feel a little bit more intimate here. And just wanted to start off, segmentation, I feel like is kind of sounds like a boring topic. Do y'all think that segmentation is, maybe it's a little bit boring, but is it a necessary topic that we need to talk about in the revenue management industry?
Yeah, I think it's definitely needed. I say it kind of sounds boring, but it's probably one of the things you argue about the most, right? So it's always up in conversation. It kind of applies to everything from pricing to reporting, to communication. So like you discuss it all the time. So even if it's a bit dry, it's kind of a necessity.
Yeah, and the word segmenting, can kind of be interpreted differently. I've heard people call it clustering or grouping, or but as a portfolio gets bigger, and even really a smaller portfolio of under 20 can benefit from doing this. Really beyond that, it's almost a necessity if you're going to practice, prescriptive, efficient revenue management. This grouping, clustering, segmenting is really key.
Oh, definitely. Now, Jordan, you said it's something that we argue about the most. What are some of the challenges that you've encountered when working with property managers, revenue managers, when they're either trying to implement segmentation or you're trying to have them let go of maybe the segments that they're kind of holding on to?
Yeah, I feel it's really similar to like comp sets, right? Everybody that's familiar with comp sets, that's kind of like its own form of segmentation or clustering. But you're going to argue about all the different attributes because everybody kind of thinks about things slightly different, especially if you're just developing your revenue management program. And so, you can split it based on bedroom and bathroom count, size, location, what's the strategy you're taking or the owner restrictions you have on that particular property. And so, since there's so many ways to split it, there's always a different way to do it. And so that's what you'll end up discussing a lot. I think some of the challenges I've seen the most is people that kind of overprescribe or oversegment to the point where it's not useful anymore. The human brain can only track about 7 to 10 things simultaneously. And so if you're trying to balance more segments than that in a particular part of your portfolio, then you're cognitively incapable of doing it. So you have to make sure you don't overcomplicate things.
That definitely makes sense.
Yeah, I think, and we view it as kind of a living, breathing thing because as your portfolio changes or evolves, you may need to, shake it up and evolve. What worked a year ago might not be the right approach. And that might be because your portfolio has changed or because the market has changed too. And you want to think differently about the inventory that you have. But it's definitely a debated topic. I would agree with Jordan on that. It's not black and white by any means. And one sign, though, that it's not working, whatever you have is not working, would be that it's not useful. You actually don't use that to drive a decision or to pull a lever in the tech. One other thing I would just add is this is not just about what are you doing in your revenue management software, whether or not you have software, but this is an alignment conversation too, because you might have another data platform like an AirDNA or a Key Data, other ways you look at your own data or market data, and you probably have a PMS. And there's ways to code or tag or group in all of these systems. And ideally, you've got this as a baseline for how you, from your ops to your commercial marketing team, think about this. It's nice if you can get alignment too.
Just to ride Heather's coattails real quick. Like she said, you have to make sure it's useful. And I think one way you do that is by being really explicit in what the purpose of that segment is, right? So you can do segments for tons of different things. It can be based on reporting, and maybe you're trying to scorecard your performance compared to other inventory you could acquire, right? Maybe you're using it for like pricing and inventory controls, your traditional revenue management. But there's tons of things you could use these groups and segmentations for. And so just be really specific in what you're trying to accomplish, and that'll really help kind of guide the group and hopefully keep it useful.
So I know it's not black and white, but if you think that your current groupings, your current segmentation is okay, how often should maybe a revenue manager or maybe a head of operations actually take a step back and evaluate if things need to be mixed up and changed? Because I feel like it's not something that's always front of mind, but it might, it might be good to be intentional in thinking about this. How
Maybe
often?
an example I'll use like ski. So let's say you have a smaller portfolio, but you're growing your portfolio in like a ski market. Maybe you don't have ski in, ski out to begin with. But if you add that kind of inventory, that's a location or attribute amenity that matters, and you may want to track that. So that might lead you to kind of build some grouping, clustering around that. And that would be new, like if you didn't have that type of inventory originally. Another one might be hot tubs in a market like that. Like, if the data shows that that is an amenity that matters and you can charge more, and those types of properties have higher conversion, it's worth talking about, right? And in some cases, you might even use that, right, to try to add more hot tubs to properties. So that's just an example of, but in some markets, a hot tub doesn't matter. So you have to kind of understand if it's meaningful or not in your market.
Yeah, and like Heather said, like some of it's seasonal, right? So like here in Austin, a lot of times when I had larger, like, multifamily properties, you could generally kind of break it down to like the central business district and then like the outskirts of downtown. And those were two pretty solid segments to work with. But then like when the Austin City Limits Music Festival happens, like you have to bust out a separate segment for that because you just want all the stuff that's super close in walking distance to the festival, right? So some things like ski in, ski out or hot tubs kind of seasonal, right? That you would review as they become relevant or not relevant. Other than that, I think like quarterly, I kind of take a look at it, slash depending on new inventory that comes on or leaves. Because really, when you're doing the segmentation and creating these groups, right, you're trying to get them to be almost identical or right as similar as possible, so you can handle them as similar as possible. And so as you have new properties come on and go off, you're gonna have to adjust your group. So I think anytime there's a big acquisition or turnover, you have to review as well.
Makes sense. So for those out there that might not be segmenting well or segmenting at all, how would grouping help with operations, help with time savings? Like what is like the value of I like Jordan what you said before about how like our brain's gonna like keep track of so much. Um, but can segmentation actually like drive growth? Like Heather, you mentioned adding more of these types of units to our properties.
Yeah, I think so. Kind of off like the 7 to 10 things, right? So they did an experiment for Army command and control, and they determined, you can only manage about 7 things. And so that's why you see a lot of these units broken into groups of only 7, right? You only have like 7 subordinate units max in an Army structure. And so, the same happens when you look at your properties. It's kind of like if you're a teacher, right, and you're going on a field trip. There's too many kids to manage. You have to break them into groups. You have to get chaperones, and then it's much easier to kind of manage that group. And so it's great because it's easier, it takes some of the stress off you, maybe splits it up, makes it more manageable. But it also means you have to have more chaperones or more revenue managers, right, looking at this stuff when you do it. And it also means there's kind of more papers to grade at the end of the day. So you just kind of have to balance how many groups it is. But what it does is it just makes it more manageable chunks.
Maybe to expand on that point too, like I think it's important to say that it's not that no matter how big your portfolio is, you think in terms of 7, but I have experienced that too. Like having more than 7 direct reports is not ideal. But the way to think, maybe to say, well, if you have 300 listings, can you really group them into just 7? But thinking in terms of how you drill down, right? So maybe you have 3 distinct locations and you start with that. And then underneath that, you want to think about if you have just then like a big kind of mess of 15 that don't really have a logic or a way to look at a roll up, that might start to get messy. And to Jordan's point, right, you really can't process that. So maybe also think in terms of if any of the folks out there have that large size, just how does your drill down work?
Yeah, and just a shameless plug for PriceLabs here. I'm not quite sure how this works in some of the other systems that many of you might be using, but in PriceLabs, I think it was last year, we released subgroups, which for many of like the larger customers that I work with has been an absolute game changer because you can still maintain kind of like that overarching sort of more broad view, but then you can still account for some of the sub segments that you really want to pay attention to. I feel like when I've worked with property managers, revenue managers in the past, I would say more so property managers than revenue managers, because I feel like revenue managers kind of get this already. But they're almost afraid of segmenting in a sense because they worry that they're unable to pay sort of individualized attention to every property. Like going from an individual property approach to a more segmented approach can be kind of a bit of a trust fall almost. When you've talked with customers that are sort of facing this challenge, or not customers, but companies that are facing this challenge, how are you sort of guiding them through this?
So that is a real concern. And you do want to make sure you have a business process in place to account for it. So some of the terminology I like to use is just top down or bottom up approach, right? So the groups are there so that you can have that 10,000-foot view, but you also do still want to have maybe a watch list or an individual unit review where even if that particular group is performing well, there might be a unit in that group that is an outlier and a true underperformer. So it's important to have both as you grow, because you could definitely lose sight of an individual unit that's underperforming if you don't have that as part of your revenue management processes.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of important to be more discriminatory, kind of the larger your portfolio gets when you create these groups. If you only have a few units, you might be able to split it into like big and small or good and bad, and that might work fine if you only have a few. If you have like 300, right, good and bad probably isn't going to help you very much as a segment. And so the larger you are, kind of the more specific you can get. But also just when you create these sets, the larger they get, the more specific you have to be on your standards, right? So the benefit of segmenting these things is that you have kind of like a more robust like data set, right? There's less variability, there's less error, there's more properties that can give you an early signal so you can make a decision. And so like just mathematically, right, you have to quadruple your sample size to half the error. And so if you're going from 1 property to 4 properties in a group, right, that's a little easy. You half your error, it's awesome. To half it again, you got to go to 16, right? And so you have to get more kind of discriminatory on what you allow in, because now the sample is just getting larger and larger. So I kind of play, a little more fast and loose with smaller portfolios or, smaller segments. And then as it gets larger and larger, you have to get a little more scientific about it.
Makes sense. So how would we get scientific? So like, do y'all have any tips and tricks? Because again, approaching this from maybe I'm not segmenting or I'm segmenting by something not useful, like house color or something silly like that. We've talked about different types of segmentation, ski in, ski out, hot tub, things that are amenity based. What is sort of like a key factor or key like thread throughout all of the different segments that we've discussed thus far, that people can use when they're trying to set this up in an effective and efficient way?
Yeah, Jordan, go ahead.
I was gonna jump in just because I feel like it's still a little nerdy to kind of jump onto my last point, but so I'm just looking for things that kind of have like a similar relationship or like a strong correlation, right? And I'm not doing math for every group I set up, but if you don't know or you kind of need to justify why this group works, I look at different factors. Maybe it's kind of the rate charged, maybe it's the occupancy, maybe it's RevPAR. Kind of looking at these performance metrics, and I'm trying to find similar patterns. They don't have to be exactly the same, but I want to see kind of generally the same behavior, and I'll kind of group those together. And so that's like how we start out. And then if you think about it conceptually without kind of all the math, right? You're just trying to find like the top thing that determines performance or determines your outcomes. And that's different for markets, like some it's location, some it's size, right? Maybe it's target demographic, whatever it is, wherever you are, you just try to find like that thing that's most important. And that's probably what you should be segmenting around.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just try to summarize that with like, you know, these categories of things, location, bedroom count, how many does it sleep, amenities, attributes, booking windows. You know, you just kind of think about like all this checklist of things you kind of ask yourself. And then there could be an outlier, right? Like you've used the logic and say these units have similar, you know, the same guest would book these units. These same units should have the same booking windows or performance. But by doing that too, you might find the outlier more easily. And it maybe leads you to say, okay, this unit just got a horrible review. And now all of a sudden it's like falling off a cliff and it's not performing like it should. But, you know, those are things that ideally by doing these groups in a way that makes sense, you can get those insights.
No, definitely makes sense. So one metric that I feel is like a little bit debatable is ADR. Would you maybe segment properties by ADR? Like what's like the pro and con in that sense?
I mean, I would just throw out there, you could have a luxury 2-bedroom that might have a high ADR in the same market where you could have a 5-bed home that is a value home. And it would never make sense to put those two together. So if you just like used a straight lens of ADR, that you would miss that. Like those two types of accommodations are not, the same party is not going to choose that home, especially if one is city center and one is, you know, outside central business district. Like, just one example of where that would be a miss, I guess.
Totally.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's hard to do it on ADR. Like maybe if you know a bunch of the other things are really similar, right? You might kind of use ADR, but you can't just look straight at ADR because there's so much that goes into it, right? You have like who are you competing against in the consideration set and what do they charge? Like how well are you performing? Are you way overpriced or way underpriced? Like that's something you have to determine before you look at ADR. So I think ADR in and of itself is really hard to do, but you can kind of like, I guess more broadly look at more market positioning, right? Like what am I charging? What are they charging? What are my results? And is that what I want or not? You know, it's not quite as cut and dry, but that's probably more effective than basing it off of ADR.
Now, sometimes like with a large portfolio, if you clearly have similar units, I'll use the like 2-bed condo kind of city center or centrally located 2-bed condo, and you truly have some that have not been renovated in 30 years and others that are brand new in an amazing building. It could make sense to then think of a layer of like value standard premium. It may make sense to do that and then to segment the market that way as well. But you'd want to vet that. I think that's not just an automatic.
No.
Another reason I think ADR is also kind of hard because like that's what most of us are trying to use or change to get the results we want, right? Like we always talk about rate. Is my rate right? Is it too high? Is it too low? What's the comp set rates? Like we talk about rate because that's what we use to get the results we want. And so if you base it kind of off of rate and ADR, like you're just basing it based on what you did in the past. And it doesn't necessarily tell you a whole lot about what's happening. And so I think you have to be careful because it is the independent variable. So that probably makes it one of the worst candidates to segment off of.
Totally agree there.
The benefit to just like understanding that might be, you know, like you think about, we don't really have brands in our industry. And so, you know, a Ritz-Carlton can lower rate and steal from like the Marriott or Holiday Inn, right? You think about like people. And in that case, you might, to understand that there are these levels of property tiers and kind of what it takes to steal share if you have like more premium product. But that gets into benchmarking too, right? Like how you are looking at your own portfolio versus how you're looking at market comps.
Sort of off topic, but seeing you mentioned it, when you are grouping your properties internally, how does that affect sort of like how you're creating comp sets or looking at the market? Are you looking sort of one-to-one? Are you creating specific comp sets for each individual listing, or is it better to look at that group level or a little bit different than that? That didn't make sense on
I
me.
guess, no, so sometimes there's like a unicorn property, right? And it's like, what is the competition for this property? But in most cases, even a smaller portfolio, if you have any level of grouping that makes sense, you would want to look at like properties to develop the comps. And then the bigger you get, the harder it is to consume an individual comp set for every property. So you do have to think in terms of that same like drill down approach for comps. And it makes sense, especially if you can see the range of what's happening within those comps. Say the 25th percentile up to the 90th percentile, right? And you just can grasp what's going on. It's just not humanly possible to consume individual comps at a certain size, Yeah.
I was about to say, I was like, Heather might be smart enough to do it, but I definitely can't. It would be great to have it individually, and like sometimes you can do that for different tests and experiments, right? But you're not logically tracking that all the time. And so it kind of goes back to, what we were saying previously is you need groups of a certain size to be meaningful. And so if you're splitting that out by individual properties, that gets really hard to maintain and manage. And then like I said before, if you're focusing on the kind of that main primary factor that's determining your performance, like your comp set should also be focused on that same thing, right? Because if that truly is what's driving your outcomes, and that's what you create your segment around, that's what you're creating your comp set around. So it should kind of align, ideologically there.
Makes sense. So, we talked about some seasonal markets. I think that we had a couple people that chatted in that said that they're in seasonal markets, or at least it seemed like that. How would being in a highly seasonal market maybe affect some of the factors that you're thinking about when you're creating your comp set, not your comp sets, your groups, versus maybe a less seasonal, maybe more urban market?
So it kind of depends, right, on why it's seasonal and how. I think some seasonal markets are really easy to kind of determine what's changed, right? And if it's not necessarily just overall demand, but maybe it's demand for ski or demand for beach or something really specific, right? You can kind of imagine how that not being a driving force kind of changes the market and changes how competitive different properties are. And so in that case, you could have like a more specific strategy of kind of, focusing on ski versus not focusing on ski. If you're just kind of like in an area that's seasonal just because of, how people travel and when they travel, and it's not tied to a specific driving factor, but that's a little harder. I like to think of it like competing lemonade stands at a farmer's market, right? When it's crowded, you can do whatever you want because everybody just wants their lemonade. But if it's an empty farmer's market, then you really have to beat that guy across from you. And I think in seasonal markets, it's kind of the same thing, right? You just have to think, everybody's clearing out of the farmer's market and I need to grab what I can get. And how do I do that? So that's kind of like a more of a strategy shift than a segmentation shift. Whereas if you're in a seasonal market with things like ski, right, that would be more of a segmentation shift.
Maybe I'll go back to something you said, Jordan, too, like events is a good one. I'll use a city center example where you have, neighborhoods, and in like a big city, these neighborhoods matter from like day to day. And then you have kind of those neighborhoods exist because those locations matter. But then there's like an event venue where things happen. And so maybe in that case, you're like, well, really, it's just these 3 neighborhoods, say, out of my 7 that are impacted by something happening at that event venue. So by having those segments, what you're doing though is just then able to build out, maybe length of stay logic for the event and attach it to the neighborhoods that matter. Similar things happen, I think, with like mega events like Olympic Super Bowl. It's like, well, how far are all of your homes to that where it's happening? Those are a little bit trickier because it's like a one-off versus where you have event venues that are there, and the events repeat year round. But if you didn't have those groups in that case, are you literally attaching individual units to the event logic? Like if you have a big portfolio, it's tough. It's not very efficient. Yeah, right. So just another example.
And I think a lot of people kind of feel overwhelmed because there's so many kind of contributing factors that go into segmentation, seasonality, and all the things we're talking about. And I think like if you're stuck, you just have to look at it from a traveler perspective, or just imagine like you're the one going. And it becomes a lot easier, right? Like how close should it be? I don't know. How close would you want to be, right? Like how many bedrooms does it need? I don't know. How many bedrooms do you need if you were going to travel there with the group you were going to go with? I think if you just kind of put yourself in their shoes, it like answers a lot of those questions that people are really, trepidatious to answer.
That's funny.
Yeah,
We
the
have a couple
customer
people,
lens. Anyway, yeah.
we have a couple of people asking questions, and they're almost like checking with us on some of their grouping questions. I'll probably leave some of that till the end, but I love to see y'all engaging with the Q&A. So audience, continue to do that. We might not be able to get to all of them. And please know, like, any opinions that we give you isn't necessarily like what you need to do immediately. Take everything with a grain of salt, but we will get to that at the end. When we are thinking about sort of long-term growth, if that is like our goal for our portfolio, is there anything that we can do at the beginning when we're segmenting to sort of allow this to be easier, where we're not going to have to go back and redo our work, 2 years from now when our portfolio has doubled?
I'll jump in. We do have a practice at Richer Logic. We have process we call your configuration workbook. It's kind of just like something that you need to have, right? And if you're even a smaller portfolio, if you have that, then like to what Jordan was saying, over time, if you're doing quarterly, twice a year, once a year, you have a place you go to revisit these kind of definitions and specific ways you categorize things. So it doesn't just exist in your technology, especially if you've got, your PMS, key data, PriceLabs, and you're trying to align them. It's nice to have a place where you kind of workshop it.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. And it's just documentation. It's the same like for pricing strategies, right? Like you need to know what you were trying to do, or what you were implementing to keep track of if it worked or not. You only have a couple properties, you might know that you really, messed up last winter, so you want to do something different. But if you have a whole lot more than that, it gets really difficult. So you just have to document it in some sort of, workbook or shared location.
That makes sense. So, okay, sorry, just had a question there. So I was actually want to ask a couple, Bill, if you could maybe shorten your question a little bit. It's a little bit long, but we do have somebody, actually, Michaela. Nice to see you again. She had a question about, I think this is more specifically PriceLabs. So she is using tags to segment her properties. Heather and Jordan, you're both pretty familiar with PriceLabs. How do you approach tags versus groups and subgroups when segmenting and PriceLabs?
Yeah, I would split them up. I try to keep them separate because you can always kind of combine them, or if you download a report from PriceLabs, right, you can search on multiple conditions or filter on multiple conditions. So I just usually keep it separate just because it's easier to manage. But when you look at it and asking like if you should have them, look at them together separate, it depends on how many properties you have and how similarly they behave, right? So a lot of times maybe I'll look market wide and kind of get my bearings on what the market's doing. And then maybe I'll check real quick and see like maybe 2 bedrooms and 1 bedrooms aren't really doing that different. So I don't have to worry about looking at that, but maybe they're doing completely different and I have to treat them separate. So you kind of start, at a high level and drill down, and it'll become obvious, like what's a necessary split.
The other thing I would add, because they're nuanced, it's nuanced language, but it can matter depending on the technology you have. So like in PriceLabs, a group is where controls live, or subgroup, but a tag is not really where a control can live. And that's different depending on your technology. So think in terms of like, well, if you want to have a control that's efficient, because like, hey, all these properties in this neighborhood should have this event length of stay logic or something, right, that you want to apply. If you just had tags, you could still put the same control on, but it's just like a different way of thinking about it. So just know whatever your technology is, where the control aspect is versus just the filtering report, or views versus actually like setting the control, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that was a really good point, Heather. And I think the other thing is like you use tags for different reporting measures, right? So not the actions you're going to take, but it could be all sorts of random stuff. You could tag it on the strategy you're trying, right? You could tag it on what your goal is. You could tag it on what the owner wants to do. You get tagged with so many different things, right? That might not influence actions, but influence reporting. And so that's why you can add a lot of tags, but not necessarily as many groups.
Yeah, sometimes when onboarding people and they want to get really, really specific with their groups, I'm like, take all that energy, put that into your tags, and then let's reel it back a little bit when we're creating our groups and things like that.
I mean, and review your tags, right? So we kind of talked about it at the top of this session, but people get, really gung ho on segmentation and tagging. And then if you realize you have 20 tags per property and you're only using 5 of them, like delete the other ones, man, it's too much.
Yeah, it's just, more just rolling around in your brain.
There's an
space.
interesting nuance with that too, because some PMSs have integrations of the tags you've built in the PMS.
Mhm.
So there's like also just really knowing how all your tech like works together. And just like, so you can make it an intentional decision, right?
100%.
Or you choose to kind of ignore it if it's built for like an operations purpose versus a revenue strategy purpose, which is great if you have that kind of tech that's like integrated and you can see it all, but it can be complex.
No, definitely makes sense. So getting back to sort of revenue growth using these strategies, okay, say we're now past implementation, we have all of our groups set up and we're happy with how things are segmented, they're working well for us. What is how would we maybe like go through and set up specific pricing strategies for these groups, right? What are some of the key elements that you're looking at in whether a group is performing well or not well? And what are some of the changes that y'all are making? I know
I
it's
mean,
very
that's like what we get paid to do, right?
That's the golden question.
Give us all of your
The
secrets,
ultimate.
Jordan.
I don't know. I was kind of thinking, there's so many factors that go into it, right? Everybody always says it depends. I kind of think of it in like an all else being equal kind of state, right? So like all else being equal, larger, more bedroom properties, right, are going to book earlier and likely book for more. And so like that's not true all the time, but generally that's true. And so as I go through looking at strategies for these different groups, that's what I'm kind of keeping in mind. I'm like, okay, is it bigger or smaller? Should it book earlier or later? Is it a competitive market for that inventory type or not? Does it appeal to a common group? And so you kind of go through those questions and you kind of get an idea of what it should look like. And then you can determine your strategy there. It does, it does really depend on how you have it segmented and where you're at. But you're never going to have one thing that gives you the answer. So I just kind of go through all of them and say, okay, this one moves it up and this one moves it down and this one moves it left, and we're probably around here.
I mean, ultimately, it's like, did you win, right? Like, however you approached it, did you win? And really, the measure of that is not just did you beat your last year, but did you beat your competition? So, no, it's important too, of course, because an owner is maybe just, like, well, did I make more money than last year? But ultimately, if you can show that you beat the market, you beat your comps, that's the goal, whether you did that through occupancy or rate. Um, you know, that's to me like what you did worked. That's how you can validate.
Definitely makes sense. Definitely makes sense. So we do have a question from Bill, and it's a bit of a long question, but Bill has a handful of units across 10 different resorts within a mile of each other. He's saying that they're all pretty much 2 or 3 bedroom units. So right now he has a group of all of these units that are within a mile of each other in similar resorts, um, in a group together. That's how he's sort of segmenting his properties. But the problem that he's facing now is it better to then look at maybe a group of properties in the market that sort of is also representing multiple of those buildings, or is it better to further segment and actually look at the individual building that each of these listings are in? How would you all approach that? Sorry, I know it's kind of a just throwing it on you.
So it really does matter if it's like a massive resort versus like a 20 unit building. So maybe that would be a first question I would ask is like, are these really all equal? The next thing is going back to what Jordan said is, when a customer is shopping, would that same customer be open to staying at like this resort and this resort? And like trying to kind of understand that, yeah, though they're in different buildings or resorts, do they really compete? Because the customer is going to be equally as happy in either one. And again, this isn't a black and white, but these are just questions like based on Bill's question, Bill, I would like go deeper with you on, because you do want to avoid what Jordan had mentioned, like having one group per unit. That doesn't make any sense. So how you go further with it. Those are just a few more questions maybe worth thinking through.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I thought of too, Heather. It's like, how fungible are they, right? How easily can you replace one with the other? And just like the general rule of thumb, like I'll get more specific with segments I use for like pricing actions than I do with stuff that's up reporting. And so like I might split it by building if they are different for pricing and rate setting, but likely at that small of a unit count, when I report, I'll probably roll it up, right? So it's kind of consistent month to month, and you can kind of get an idea of performance versus individual units. But yeah, I would ask exactly what Heather asked.
I think the question mentioned beach. So then I would think proximity to beach is probably a big thing. People, typical beach markets, it's like, how close am I to the beach? So that could be a layer too.
I'm sorry, my dog is like in the room here being annoying. It's okay. Very cool, very cool. So we have another question from Chris. He wants to he wants to review his last year's performance to best reset his base prices, minimum prices, maximum prices, given what he knows about each property's revenue, given last year's performance. Right now, he's sort of looking at this, it appears to be at sort of a listing level. How often, when we're doing these like segmentations and these grouping strategies, how often do we actually really need to individually sit down and look at every single property? Is doing this sort of at the end of the year and sort of reevaluating everything from the ground up, does that make sense to do? Or should we really just be looking for outliers?
Yeah, so I think my giant cat overheard that your dog was in the room, and now he wants in the room. So I think there's a pet frenzy going on here. Yeah, but I think you have to, when you strategically review it, you have to consider all the things that like we've already talked about, but also like when you're talking specifically about minimum price, max price, base price, like what are you trying to accomplish, and like what are you trying to change, right? Because all those things do something different. And so if you're only looking at changing your base prices, right, that's going to affect your price for every day in every setting. And that's going to be real different than like changing your seasonality or your demand sensitivity or having overrides for seasons. And like very rarely are you going to make huge leaps and bounds in revenue performance by like just going up 5% all year, right? That's not really like strategically how you maximize revenue. You're picking your spots. When is it a higher rate? When is it a higher occupancy? When do I encourage longer length of stays? Like that's how you optimize, right? And so like I would say like it's probably not as important to get really specific on base prices like once a year. And it's more important to see when did you do good, when did you do bad, and how could you do better.
Yeah, I agree with Jordan on that general point, is that even when you use the term median booking window, if there's any kind of seasonality, I mean, really in any market, there's some level of seasonality, that median booking window or booking window curves will change throughout the year. So if you're using everything based on kind of one number, that may not actually be the right approach to, attack each season or period or day of week the way you want to. And maybe just generally, though, it's certainly a good practice to say, am I willing to try a lower min rate? Is there a slight change to the base rate that makes sense? But if you're changing that base rate all the time, that's probably not right either. And, remembering the base rate impacts 365 days a year. So using that in a very specific case versus being more surgical.
Yeah. Like to Heather's point, I think like when I change base rates or review base rates, usually it's in conjunction with like something else I'm changing too. Right? Like I'm moving my minimum rate up, so I need to move my base rate up or down, right? So I compress the range of prices I have. Or maybe, I'm making it more seasonal. And so because I'm going to discount more in the off season, I'm going to raise my base price to maintain, higher rates during high demand season. So usually I'm using it in conjunction with something else.
Oh, you're still muted, Becca. I think you were talking.
Here we go. I'm back. Sorry. So I don't want to spend too much time on base price, but Chris did sort of have a response there. So something about base price, at least in PriceLabs, and again, I feel like a lot of the stuff that we've talked about thus far can apply to a lot of the revenue management tools that are out there. But when PriceLabs specifically with base prices, we are actually recalculating what your base price should be, pretty much on, I would say, a weekly basis. So if you go in, you can actually click the Help Me Choose a Base Price button, and you can actually see what our current recommended base price is. If it's within or outside of 5% of what your current base price is, that's when we're actually going to send you a nudge. What's nice about that is, you're not having to go in once a year and, oh, now my cat wants to come say hi too. It's just Animal Fest. What's nice about that is you don't actually have to go in once a year and sort of reevaluate everything. It's actually being evaluated on a rolling sort of constant basis. If y'all have any questions about how the base price help works or any of that, please reach out to us. And our team is more than happy to help you understand how that works. I'm sorry, Miss Roxanne, and she loves.
Becca, there was a question, I think, at the very top about cancel policy. I don't know if you were saving that for.
No, it disappeared. So I was going to try to find it as well, because I thought that was a really interesting way to go about it. Let me try to find it.
Yeah, Giovanni, I think, and it said that there's a grouping around using subgroups specifically, but around cancel policy. And that it looks like Giovanni was saying they had good experience with that, thought that worked well. Cancel policy as like an attribute or feature of the properties to group around. Because we hadn't talked about that, but it's an interesting question.
No, I like that, because it's not a strategy that like you always think about, because it's not tied to, like your average length of stay or your RevPAR and things like that. But cancellation, I think, is interesting. Jordan, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think like especially when you change your pricing strategy around like cancellation policies, it's risk management, right? You're trying to mitigate whatever risk that is or isn't covered by the cancellation policy you have in place. And so it does change like how you price or how early you want to book. And also like if you get into like calculating like the probability of cancellation based on different reservation details, like that could also be a consideration to use to do that with. I think the biggest thing is like most of the time I want to use cancellation policies seasonally, which a lot of times is really hard to do. And so you have to make the determination of kind of when you're turning those on and off based on booking window, to like capture the bookings you want. But yeah, I think it's valid because you do treat these different groups that have different cancellation policies very different.
And in some portfolios or markets, and maybe folks know this, but in market dashboards, right, you can go and you can look at what the average cancellation policies are in your market, kind of how the policies are grouped across like different bedroom or unit types. So if you're like, you know what, I'm 80% of the market is in this policy, so I'm going to put all my units in this policy. So it's not really a differentiator in your market. So it may not actually apply to many operators if in general they're like, I'm kind of just going to stay in this policy and maybe switch it seasonally, but just something that is another piece of information that could help you kind of figure that out. Look at your market mix of policies across different unit types. That question was also like, what else? So those are things that you can change, right? Like if you group them, you could change a units policy like on the fly. Another one we've talked about with folks is like pet friendly. Do you actually like group around pet friendly? It's an attribute that like could change. It's not like a physical feature or location, so that requires maybe a little bit more diligence. Like, is it worth it? I would say that like pet friendly and cancel policy might fall in those same conversations, like vetting it.
And I think,
Speaking of,
sorry,
continue. No.
yeah, but I think like all those factors that Heather just mentioned are true, and I know it's not operationally possible in every case, but when I can, I always advocate for like basically the loosest restrictions or the most allowed possible. Because I mean, I've been worked at Vrbo for a couple of years now, but I mean the stats were crazy. How much it gets improved to instant book, how many people search for pets, right? How many people want the lax, flexible cancellation policy? And really, if you think about like what you're protecting by putting those restrictions in versus the business, like you're automatically ruling out, it's usually not equal. And so what I try to do is keep those restrictions as loose as possible. And then you use kind of your rate or your offers or your maybe some stay restrictions, right? To like funnel people into the bookings you actually want to receive. But I mean, if you're not pet friendly, if you don't have instant book, if you have a strict cancellation policy, I mean, you probably just cut out like 70% of the people searching.
Yeah, you're not even showing up in step one of search. Yeah.
Yeah, I think on average, people use 7 filters on Vrbo when they're looking for vacation rentals, right? And so you gotta think like everything you do is cutting you out of a filter, and people use 7. So you gotta make it to the list.
Sounds 7. Today's like 7 day. It's a theme. So we were talking a little bit about like risk tolerance or mitigating risk, pet friendly, cancellation policies. How much does like owner preference potentially play into segmentation or owner profiles maybe?
Yeah, I think like hopefully it doesn't, right? Like ideal state, you don't want it to. You want to have the flexibility to institute what's going to do the best. But I mean, I've had really extreme cases with some clients where they have really strict relationships with their owners, and so the property owners have to approve essentially every change that you're making to any sort of strategy you're setting. And so in those cases, right, I did create groups where it's like, okay, like this one's kind of normal revenue management. And then this group is like, I better make sure I really want it because I'm gonna have to ask a bunch of people to get it done. And so you can do that. And that's more of like a functional or operational challenge as opposed to like a revenue management challenge. But preferably, right, nobody has any restrictions and they just let me go out there and do what I do.
So the term we use a lot is owner constrained, because typically an owner preference is not a good thing. It's a constraint, and it's preventing you from revenue managing properly. So if you can avoid that, obviously better. You should be like, hey, we're the revenue management expert, right? You've hired us to run your property. We should have full control. But the reality is it does exist. So if you have a few, sometimes it's nice to like group them where they should be, but then like tag them or kind of, designate them as being owner constrained. It could be the minimum rate is the constraint, or it could be the length of stay requirement is the owner constraint. And then sometimes that leads to being successful and saying, hey, because you've given us this constraint, your property's underperforming. Let me show you. But it's tough. I get it. Like, you can't just say you're not going to work with people that have preferences, owners that have preferences.
A perfect world. So we have about 4 minutes left now. I did want to just show, I'm going to share my screen because you mentioned the cancellation policies, part of market dashboards, and I think that it's a piece that people overlook a lot. So if you're a PriceLabs user or not, you can use our market dashboards. You'll see it under the market research tab in the upper right-hand side of the screen. Once you have your dashboard set up, just below this map, this is where you'd create your comp set. So again, if you're segmenting your own portfolio and you want to create comp sets that are, similar or sort of equal to your segmentation, you would do that right here. But all the way down, and I think this is why it's overlooked, all the way at the end of this report, this is where you can see things like amenities, and then policies and fees. So discounts, weekly and monthly, as well as cleaning fees, as well as cancellation policies. So whether you're having discussions with your owners about which policy you are choosing, or maybe you're going with a little bit more of a strict policy versus a less strict policy, you can actually have some data that backs you up. We're showing you the number of listings or percentage of listings in your market with said strategy or said policy in this case, and the percentage of bookings that have come in for those listings within the past 30 days. So super interesting there. Just wanted to plug that because I don't think it's something that everybody references, but I think it's something that's really, really helpful.
Yeah, really helpful to have the conversations, because then you know what's happening in your market. Yeah.
Right. And it just elevates you too. If you're having these conversations with your owners and you're able to be like, hey, here's this chart and I now have all the data, it just makes you, it shows that you are the expert that you are. So again, we have like 2 minutes left. Any final thoughts, any takeaways if that you want the audience to bring with them going into their journey with segmentation going forward? Jordan, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, sure. Takeaways for segmentation. That's difficult. But I would say just in general, right? You need to create segments, especially as you grow to be effective. When you create these segments, I'd be really specific on why you're creating them and what you intend to do with them. And then as your portfolio and segments grow larger, I would be more strict or more discerning as to how I'm putting these segments together and which properties go with which.
And just, I guess, closing thoughts on that is it is really a non-negotiable. If you have a large portfolio and you're not effectively using these, you're not running efficient revenue management. So, and if you have them, but they don't serve a purpose, that's another red flag that they should be revisited. And again, just encouraging, this is like a living and breathing cycle that is pretty important to having efficient revenue management in your organization.
Yeah, thank you both so much for joining us today. And thank you to everybody who took time out of their Thursday morning, afternoon, evening to join us. This will be posted on YouTube. It'll also be on whatever your favorite podcast method of listening to podcasts is. So join us there. We also have a lot of other great episodes with other wonderful revenue managers within the space. If you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at support@pricelabs.co. And also Heather and Jordan, if you want to plug maybe your socials or how people can get in touch with you.
Yeah, you can get in contact with me at jordan@revpartyconsulting.com. And if you want to follow something on social, to follow my cat at Polaris the Aristocat on Instagram. That's probably the most entertaining one.
I'm definitely going to do that.
And I just put in the chat there my email, heather@richerlogic.com or richerlogic.com, our website. And the best place to find us is on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, y'all, thank y'all so much. I hope you have a great rest of your Thursday and a great weekend, and I look forward to chatting with y'all soon.
Thanks, Becca. Thanks all.
Thanks.